All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ilan Mack, and with me is,
John Montgomery.
and today we're going to talk, we want to get together to talk about a few different issues. We're two friends who are notorious for our extremely long, extremely detailed back and forths, and we love to look at an issue, debate it, take the devil's advocate, look at it from each side, and try to reach some kind of understanding about it, even when we don't necessarily agree. And we also have an international perspective because I'm from the United States and John is from Ireland. And
And different backgrounds, of course.
yes,
Like
and he has, yeah, please.
I'm a microbiologist, so I've very scientific background, and that's my,
Yeah,
I suppose, main area of education.
and
Whereas my interest would be more politics and stuff that Ilan is good at.
exactly. My background is in studying government and history and politics and how those intersect. But we're both interested in society, culture, how history plays a role in things. So, given everything that's been going on, mainly in the US recently, we thought it would be appropriate to talk about Black Lives Matter and the issue of race in America today and police in America today. And I
And
think,
around the world,
eh,
because I think really it has spread now, and like there's at least protests in 40 or 50 countries, I think, around the world. So um, it has really become a global, either through solidarity, which I think mostly in Ireland it is. Um, Ireland does obviously have systemic racism, but I think it's quite different in structure and cause and stuff like that. And like we don't have cops killing people because they're black. We might have other issues like discrimination because that person has an African name or um, things along those lines. But uh, but yeah,
yeah,
it's a different solution really to a
and
different
part
problem.
of that is that the police play a different role in different countries. And um, especially in the United States, the police have a long list of roles and responsibilities that they play within society that I don't think they really play in Ireland and in a lot of other places, especially in developed countries and countries with more of a social safety net. Uh, the U.S. is kind of lacking in that way, and it's it's sort of a theme that the police get handed more and more responsibilities within society, basically dealing with issues like homelessness, right? Turning that into a primarily criminal issue that the police deal with, um, putting police in schools and having them be kind of the de facto social worker in the school and having to deal with problems there, uh, being put into so many different kinds of minor disputes in everyday life.
So
And
can we just take one of those, like for example, homelessness? Can you like break down how American police actually deal with that?
sure, and it's kind of, it goes back to it's how we deal with these issues more broadly. So in the United States, there be there is quite a bit large homeless problem in many different cities around the country, many different areas. And you know, you'll get homelessness in in basically any society um, that is any sort of capitalist society, right? But in the United States, our sort of support system for the homeless is quite limited. Obviously, we have shelters and we have food banks and we have organizations, NGOs that help support the homeless population. But beyond that, there's very little in terms of housing solutions, low income housing, the support we give for unemployment, the support that the healthcare that's provided when you're unemployed. Uh, there's all these different things that link together, which kind of drive you into homelessness, right? And when you are homeless, how many solutions do you have towards getting yourselves out of that problem? And who has to deal with uh, people who are homeless? Who is helping people who are homeless, right? So
Yeah.
I think when I refer to the police being used as as the resource for dealing with homelessness, instead of providing housing solutions, dealing with the issue with social workers and with administrators who are working to get people into housing. We deal with it with the police, who uh, basically, whenever any kind of issue arises with homeless people, they come to remove them, right? So if they're in a park, take them away. They're in,
Do they lock them up, or do they just move them along?
as far as I know, they just move them around. But as you can imagine, if there's any kind of illegal activity, obviously they'll lock them up, right?
Right. So it's not really illegal to, or it's not prosecuted at least, to sleep on a park bench.
In That's the thing, is it's complicated. It really depends on the place and um, different states, different cities have different
Right.
ordinances, and what kind of land is it private land? Is it public land? Uh, is it open space? Is it by a waterway? Is it by this? Is it on the street? Is it next to the street? Is it on the sidewalk? These things all come into play, right? Um, but I think the issue that I'm trying to bring up is that instead of offering constructive solutions to kind of try to address the root issues of the problem, and try to address why we have this rising homelessness problem, we kind of criminalize it and try to push it out of view. And
Yeah.
I
Well,
think that's emblematic of our approach in the U.S. in general to a lot of social issues that don't require that it's not a criminal issue so much as a broader societal failure. And I want to hear what you have to say about that.
yeah. Well, I think like the US is not alone on that, and I think most countries, even socialist countries, have a big problem when it comes to trying to treat symptoms rather than causes. Um, like homelessness is mostly a symptom. There's not many people that are falling into homelessness through choice or anything like that. I think once you're there, a small amount of money basically can help you get out of it, and that's kind of the key argument for these supports. So in Ireland, like one of the problems that you'd have there is that outside of Dublin, living on the social welfare is relatively doable. Um, in Dublin, I think it probably like it's a different debate for Dublin, to be fair. But if you're homeless, you can't claim that because you don't have an address. Or if you do want to claim it, you have to be registered to a homeless shelter. And those homeless shelters, I've talked to some homeless people, and they're dangerous. Like, it's more dangerous to sleep in a homeless shelter than it is to sleep on the road. And that's why so many of them choose to sleep on the road.
Yeah.
Um, um,
And and
like we don't have subways. There's no subways in Ireland.
yeah, and what you said, and sorry, what you said before is really, I think, important because you're saying living outside Dublin off of the public welfare is relatively doable, but living in Dublin, different story. And I think
Yeah.
that itself is a huge root cause for homelessness around the country. If you look at cities like San Francisco, LA, New York City, Seattle, these are cities with they're sort of the hubs of the economic drivers of the United States economy right now. They're sort of information hubs where a lot of people our age are moving to, and it's number one driving out a lot of people who have lived there for a long time because it's getting unaffordable, and
Yeah.
it's also it's just making things so unaffordable for the people who have lived there that it's really fed into this broader issue of unemployment that's been a real issue in these cities. You look at Seattle, and that's a huge problem that's been coming up in the city in the past 10, 15 years because of
Mm-hmm.
the economic development of the city and the growth of companies like Amazon, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's pretty interesting. But like, and you look at statistics, like you said, a small amount of money can help alleviate the problem, right? And
Yeah.
even, even trying to make low income housing more broadly available, right? Your mobility is severely limited. Let's say you are unemployed, sorry, not unemployed, homeless. Your access to transportation is probably limited to public transportation wherever you are, right? Making it pretty difficult to move from one place to another. So you're kind of stuck waiting for where you are to have more affordable options for
But
you, right?
even on a more basic level than that, like so we'll say you have an interview coming up tomorrow, and what are the things that you need to, what are the boxes that you need to check before you go into that job? Like, okay, I'll just assume for a second that it's not a particularly good job. Like, we're not talking about going to an IT firm or anything like that, where you'd have to have done all your research and all of that kind of stuff. We'll just take a pretty menial job, and but you still need to have a clean shirt. You still need to have food in your stomach because otherwise you won't be able to focus on the questions that you're being asked to answer.
Yeah,
And like, okay, that shirt, that clean shirt, and that meal might only cost a tenner, but because the government isn't necessarily putting that money out there into the to solve the causal problem, they actually wind up spending thousands down the line um, to deal with the symptom.
yeah, and
And then they'll turn around and go, "Oh, we don't have the money." But if you had invested the money 6 months ago, you wouldn't have this guy in prison right now.
yep,
Um,
yep, yeah. So in the end, it ends up being a much greater cost to society if that person is stuck in this rut of
right,
of a desperate situation. Nobody wants to be in that desperate situation, um, and and that's where like more resources in terms of social workers can help, right? Just helping to
right,
kind of guide, like, or to assist people who are have fallen into these desperate circumstances, you know?
right, yeah,
And there's a lot of statistics that are floating around, but a statistic that really caught my eye is people estimate that it would cost something around 30 billion US dollars to to build enough low income housing for all the homeless people in the US and to essentially fix this problem. Whereas we spend $100 billion on our law enforcement.
right,
And it's just that disparity in addressing root causes versus reacting to social issues that I think what the US really struggles on.
Where
You
does
know?
that 100 billion go? Because from my understanding, one of the key antagonistic qualities of the police in America is that they're relatively underpaid, and then you have somebody shouting in your face. Like I'd be watching the videos sometimes, and black or white, protester or counter protester, if somebody's up in your face like that, it's going to irritate you. Um, and like as a police officer, I know you're there to keep the peace. And like I've seen unprovoked attacks by the police on protesters, and
Yeah.
absolutely that is abhorrent. And you know, the obvious argument is, well, police are supposed to be above this. But if you're only getting whatever $30,000 or $40,000 for somebody pretty much spitting in your face, like especially when there's a pandemic going on and you're potentially bringing that home to your family and all these other things, um, you could kind of see like these guys are not being paid enough to do this job,
And
and that
that's,
would make you angry.
but that's also another thing, another stressor, I would say, for the situation is that police are given too many things that they have to do. You know, they have to solve all of these problems when they're really what they should be doing is strictly, catching criminals and solving crimes and and all that kind of stuff, right? That should be their
Right.
mandate, right? Keeping community, like we've given this enormous mandate of keep communities safe. Oh, provide security for this, blah blah blah, block this off, deal with traffic, deal with people's marital problems, deal with people's uh, you know problems with their neighbors, deal with this community like issue, blah 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 blah. Provide security for this event, provide security for this school, for this center. Like it's just a
I,
whole, yeah.
on face value, I actually like the idea of having a police officer in a school, but only if they have the right mentality. Um, so, like, regardless of where your school is, whether it's whatever in projects um, or in a posh school, like a posh private school or whatever, that officer should not necessarily be carrying a gun. Um, like
Well,
or like maybe they should have access to it because you do have a problem with school shootings and stuff like that, but by having them like walking through these metal detectors, like I don't know how real that even is. Like it's something that you see a lot in the movies. I never went to school in the States, but that's kind of my idea of what school is, that you have to go through a metal detector, which is just bizarre. Like,
um, yeah, I mean, in a lot of schools you do. In a lot of uh, in a lot of schools you do, and it it's it's frustrating. Well, now I kind of want to switch gears a little bit, right? Because when we're talking about resources and schools, right? You have police officers, police resource officers, basically in every school, right? I went
yeah,
to a relatively well-off suburban school. We had one. Schools, inner cities, rural areas, doesn't really matter. You'll have a police officers in most schools. There's millions and millions of schools that don't have guidance counselors, millions and millions of schools that don't have therapists, millions and millions of schools that don't have social workers, um, people who may be able to address more of the root issues of what kids are going on rather than reacting to when something does get out of hand, you know? And that's the same question of resources, resource application that we opened this with, right? It's, and so my question is, why do we do this? Is it because of a stigma against though, like the efficacy of preventative services, or is it a stigma about mental health, or is it a stigma about the value of social work or about public health, or is it
Or is it just negligence?
or is
Like, you
it
know,
negligence and a mistaken belief that a police officer is enough to keep you safe? Is it this mistaken belief that force is the only, or even just the presence of force is enough of a deterrent to keep bad things from happening, right?
yeah,
It's like the same idea about drug enforcement, right? The idea that, oh, you'll get in trouble, all this trouble if you do drugs, right? But
yeah,
that doesn't address anything. That's not going to prevent anything. That just punishes the people who are in those circumstances that use drugs to deal with their very real issues.
yeah. We had a conversation before about how a white person versus a black person would approach the three strike rule. That uh, like you could be caught a dozen times, never even get one strike on your name, whereas a black guy who is technically being caught one quarter of the amount of times that you have um, winds up going to prison for an extremely long time.
Yeah, and that's basically what white privilege looks like, right? I mean, let me put it this way. In my high school, I would say maybe 80%, again, come from the suburbs, middle class, I would say. Um, I would say like maybe 80%, 70 to 80% of the people in my school smoked weed fairly regularly, right?
Right.
Um, everyone I know, basically everyone I know, has been caught or come close to getting caught. And I don't know anybody who has actually gotten into legal trouble because of it. Actually, no, I know one person because he had a shit ton of weed in the backseat of his car, in the back of his car at the mall, and that's the
So a
only
shit ton
person.
being more than amount than the police officer believed was his for him. Like,
More like several ounces.
okay, right. So yeah, I mean, like several ounces, you could smoke it yourself.
It's
Like
stay
it
for
could
a
be
very
for
long
you.
time. Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
could be. It could be. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But
But
exactly.
but
But
from an officer's perspective, it's not like, it's
but
they think that's for sale or supply. Like,
and you take it for granted that you'll be okay, basically,
right.
right? Like there's there's not a whole lot of fear around getting caught smoking weed. And there's obviously a lot more to smoking weed, of whether it should be legal, whether it shouldn't be legal. We're not going to get into that, but just the idea that we don't really have to worry about smoking weed affecting our future. We don't ever smoking weed having to give us a record. You know,
So your area is predominantly white, right?
Well, yeah. So my area is predominantly white. We're next to a pretty diverse, uh, larger town called Patterson. So that's kind of right next to my town, but that's kind of the exception. For the
Right.
most part, my area is uh,
White.
middle to upper middle
Okay.
class kind of
So
area, suburbs.
let, if there was a black guy walking through your town, um, like what I'm trying to get at is it the maybe better temperament of the police officers in a white community, so that even when they do come across a black person, um, that they're are they being a bit more lenient, or is it just that like black person always
Are you
gets
talking about like location versus
yeah,
versus
so like
race?
basically they might have different training in that area and a more
Got it.
militaristic training in whatever, the Bronx or something. I don't know.
Yeah, um, that wouldn't surprise me, because lived experience. If you have a different lived experience, or if people around you have a different lived experience, that definitely influences you. But
Right.
I think that's also part of the problem, is that if you are a black person or another minority in an area that's predominantly white, like that setting off alarm bells in a police officer's head is kind of the problem, right? That's what profiling is.
Mm.
Um, this idea that just because someone is black, they're automatically suspicious, automatically a potential threat. And I think that that is the first domino towards something problematic happening, is that,
Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
I understand that, like, uh, black people are getting searched more and all of that kind of
mm,
stuff. But actually, what I'm wondering is that, like, so we'll say you have done something that warrants a search, regardless of your color.
okay,
Like,
so
black
you're guilty.
person here, white person here, the cop saw you, right?
Okay,
In
yeah,
both situations, cop sees you and you're white,
yep,
cop
yep,
sees you
yep.
and you're black. You have done something. The cop is entitled to search you. They're okay on that front, and they catch you with weed. Like, the minimum amount that no, we'll say the average amount, like an ounce, right?
Yeah.
Um, is the black person in the rich area, like he lives there and everything,
Yeah.
he's actually middle class, went to the same school as you, is
Yep.
he
Yep.
more likely to get a conviction? Like, do you have any idea how much more likely, or?
I, I, yeah, I don't have the exact number, but it's something like, so drug use between white people and black people around the same levels. And if I'm
Okay,
not mistaken, it's something like you're 3 or 4 times more likely
to be prosecuted.
to be prosecuted for it.
Right,
Yeah, yeah, something like it's a degree of multiples. It's not a
right,
fraction.
right,
Yeah,
right, right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so and that goes into, right, the police officer themselves, the judge, the prosecutor, the defense. What's the defense attorney telling you to do if you have one, or if you
Mm.
request one,
When there's that many people involved in how long you should go to prison for, it's hard to believe that you won't come across a racist, right?
and that's the thing, is that, uh, and this is actually some big thing I want to address right now, is like coming across a racist. Um, we have this idea in our heads, right, of a racist, not a racist, right? And it's kind of how we think about good person, bad person. Oh yeah, I know him. He's a good person. Oh yeah, I know him. He's kind of a shitty person, right? And I think that that's kind of where our problems start, right? Because
You have to
nobody,
categorize everybody.
yeah, exactly. And it's impossible. Like it you as a person may do more racist things than someone else, right? But that racism is an action, right? It's Racism is an action to me. It's not a descript. It's not an adjective. It's an act.
Or a collection of actions. Like, you can't
But
you
that's the
can't
thing.
feel racist. You're like,
Yeah, yeah. Because we all
either.
we all have implicit biases, right? We all have learned activity and learned assumptions and
Yeah.
prejudices in our minds, right? But where the racism comes in is how we act on those. It can be as small as giving someone a weird look, as crossing the street, and as much as assaulting, hurting, killing someone, right? But there's different degrees of racist actions, but it's an adverb. It's not an adjective. It doesn't it doesn't define you, right? So what you need to do, and you need to sort of call out internally, okay, the thought I just had, your first thought, is not okay, or it's problematic, and making sure that you don't act on those prejudices or problematic
Mhm.
impulses, right? On racist impulses, right? because we all, no matter who we are, no matter where we grow up in, have because we're a part of modern society, we've grown up and we've exposed to popular culture. We've grown up with these ideas in our head, right? And these biases and these prejudices, and how you turn that into action defines who you are, right? And defines the
Right.
life of the person who you're acting towards, right?
Uh,
So
uh, Sorry, go
yeah,
on. Yeah.
so
Um,
in the context of the policeman, the judge, the the prosecutor, the defense attorney, it's the weight of all of their learned experiences and prejudices and everything that's coming out in their actions, right? And their and the issue there is to how do we, number one, keep people from doing that in a way that's sustainable, and number two, are there any guidelines that we can kind of hold people to where they don't have as much leeway to act based on race. So yeah, so say what you were gonna say.
um, but I forgot.
Talk too
Sorry.
much. That's it. Running my
But
big mouth.
well, yeah. Sorry. So one of the big, I suppose, it's kind of a new thing. Like I don't, I can't say that I've really experienced it that much going back through time. But just in the last month or two, a lot of people have taken a really binary approach. Like you're either with us or you're against us. And that's always been an aspect of the far right. You know, it's like if you don't agree with everything that I say, then you're against me.
Yep.
Um, but it is increasingly part of the left side. Like you know, I think
Yeah.
in the first big political thing that I've really noticed it in from the left point of view is the Black Lives Matter
Well,
protest.
it's not just Black Lives Matter. It's also the feminist movement. It's also the environmental movement. And the thing is, with with race in America, it's such, number one, a taboo topic. It's
Yeah,
so difficult to talk about race in America, and people who have never
as
thought
two white
about,
guys, like
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, people who have never thought about race, never considered how race plays a role in society, are coming to grips with it right now for the first time in their whole
right.
lives. Um, and it's also the fact of how deeply embedded it is into, number one, people's everyday experiences, and number two, the different life, the quality of life of the racial disparity and quality of life. Um, it's it's so hard to look for gray area, I guess,
Right.
in that in that arena, right? And it's, I think we tend to let it envelope everything, right? So like take down the statues, uh, censor this like silence this voice who's speaking out against it, this, and this, and this, right? And I think where people diverge is nobody wants somebody, like, okay, not nobody. Most people don't want there to be such a huge disparity in you know in wealth, in justice, in education, in everything. I think I would like to think most people don't want these things. Um, but I think where we have problems is when we think about, okay, now what do we do about that? Because there's a lot of different answers to that, and there's a lot of gray area in that, right? You
Yeah.
have you have people anywhere from, uh, you know, there should be reparations, for
I think like some aspects of what do we do about it is, sorry. I think our connection broke down for a second.
yeah, sorry, say what you're gonna say.
um, I think like I was actually going to bring up the topic of reparations because uh, I am so against it. Um, I actually struggle to put it into like I without sounding like one of those guys. I really struggle to go. It's such a stupid idea
Well,
because there are like wealthy like black people, and like if you turn around to like I don't know um, some black actor or whatever, even an engineer, like he could be it could be a black guy with a normal job, and you go, here's $10,000 because your ancestors were raped and enslaved and taken from their home, and all of that kind of stuff. Like, how the fuck does that address the issue at all?
so
Um,
what if that's scaled for income, right? Like progressive, like people over a
but
certain
but
level don't
just
get anything.
yeah, well that's kind of what I would do, is that scrap the colored thing, and just work on like, okay, if you're below $10,000, well, actually, I don't know, if you're below $30,000 a year, and you live in apartments and all the rest, then you're like, take Harvard for example. Harvard have to take um, like one person that's on less than $30,000 for every person they take over $100,000, right? Um, that would be a better way to address the issue, as far as I'm concerned. There's no mention of color in that situation, and like a white person who's poor through their ancestors' bad luck or bad choices has just as much a chance as a black person who lives next door to him, and the person who, like the black person who's on $150,000 a year, has the exact same chances as the white person who's on $150,000 a year. There shouldn't be like it shouldn't be written into law that like uh, Harvard must take uh, you know 3,000 of each of these categories. I don't see that as
So now you're
equality.
talking, you were talking about reparations, and now you're talking about affirmative action.
Um, well, yes, reparations, I suppose. I just see reparations as really stupid and get rid of the idea. Um, but your replacement idea could be a modified form of affirmative action. That's kind of what I'm getting at. So yes, take like, we'll say it's going to cost uh, uh, $1 trillion to address this issue. We can either give every black person in America a share of $1 trillion, or we can take $1 trillion and some clever uh, writing of laws, like go like, you have to do this for this, like that kind of stuff doesn't actually cost the US government anything, which is kind of the problem with getting a lot of this stuff done. It's like, as soon as you bring up an issue like equality or anything like that, the first question that's asked is, oh, how much is this going to cost us, even though your military budget is absolutely insane. Like,
Yeah,
but
priorities.
yeah, for sure. But so I think like, solutions like that, they don't technically cost the government anything. Like, obviously it has a cost because somebody is paying for that. But that's essentially one way to guarantee that a rich person is paying for a poor person, and it gets all of that hidden talent in your essentially slums. Like, they're not much more than slums. The poorest parts of America, poorest parts of Ireland aren't much more than slums. I've lived in some of them. um, and yeah, they're like, I think our classes are closer to equal than years there.
Yeah.
Most people in Ireland are middle class, like.
Right.
But so like my main objection is taking anything that that so like when you look at a poor school in a poor area that is continuing this cycle over and over again, um, I don't necessarily see that as a race issue. It's a race issue that there are more black people in there, like a astronomically disproportionate amount of black people. That's a race issue. But but it's not a race issue that that those um, sorry, I don't really know how to phrase it, but like in order to fix it, I don't see it as a race issue. You know what I mean?
Okay. All right. So I'll share my thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm.
I have heard some kind of variation of what you're suggesting, and I think while the idea makes sense, the problem is I see two problems with it. The first is that it ignores kind of all of the historic barriers that people have faced, which has led for it to become, which has caused it to become the way it is now. So, for example, like government policies, like I don't know if you've heard of redlining, which was
Yeah, that's the drawing of like area voting blocks, basically, isn't it?
it's not actually voting. What it is that it's the federal government saying to or to banks, don't give loans to people in this area because it's an at-risk area, right? Or
Right.
it's you're at risk of not recouping your loan, and we don't want to insure people. We're not going to insure mortgages in this area, right?
Okay.
So
It's even worse than voting.
yeah, well,
I did come across this actually because then you can't get your education and
well, it's a
you
huge
can't ever get
problem.
out of there.
Yeah, because then if a few black people move into the neighborhood and it becomes red line, then the only like there's this thing called white flight. So white people will leave, and
Mm-hmm.
because you're not able to get a loan, it's much more risky for people in that neighborhood to get because many banks won't give a loan without a federal mortgage guarantee. Then you have people try to get much more risky loans, or they'll just rent, right?
So it's kind of like the exact opposite of gentrification.
It's it's kind of like a government sponsored, um, like don't lend to these people kind of
Right.
program, right? And that's one. I have
That's
a
crazy.
list of a few different ones. Um, Legal segregation, like actually written into law, black people can't live here. Things like allocation of public housing, right? So have you ever heard of the phrase like the projects? Oh, I was in the projects, blah, 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 right? So when public housing started to become really popular way for people to get housing, it's basically government funded housing, right? And the government allocated this housing based on race. So it gave white people the opportunity to get the best kind of housing and then leaving the worst housing for black people, right? So there's that. Then there's zoning, right? What kind of buildings can there be in certain areas, right? So they would, let's say, putting an industrial park next to a primarily black neighborhood, using placing a highway to cut off a black neighborhood from the rest of the city. Um, Things like that, like allowing a certain number of liquor stores in an area, or a certain number of gun stores, or a certain number of this, or a certain number of that, restricting how many schools can be in a certain area, right? So these are all ways in which, like, the action, like uh, the legal, sorry, maps were built in which areas of color were targeted and kind of suppressed, right? And how people segregated. And that's just government policy. You also have, you know, personal personal racism, right? So things like racial covenants. I don't know if we've ever talked about this. Basically, restrictive covenant. It says who can or cannot live in this house. So when the person sells the house, you can write into the deed, this property shall not be sold to a black person or a person of color or a Jew or whatever. So there were a lot of these all around the country. You have obviously like violence and intimidation of people. So a black person moves into your neighborhood and then a cross starts burning in their front lawn. Alienation, people not talking to them, um, things like that, or actual violence. Way back, you had lynching, looting, all of these kinds of things. So it kind of ignores all when you separate it from race, it ignores all of those factors that led the situation to be like what it is today. And actually, when those kind of policies go away, the disparity does tend to go down, right? Uh,
Of course,
between
because
naturally, it's like you're not just going to like some people are going to break out of their situation,
yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's you're starting from such a like different starting point that in order for there to be any kind of significant uh, crunch or significant equalizer, then there needs to be actual policies to address that, right? And in regards to the affirmative action thing you said about just making it toward by just gearing affirmative action towards low income people, I agree that that is could be a very effective tool. The problem is that it leaves the door open for educators, for school administrators, for people offering jobs, for this, for that, for their biases to come into play and for them to choose a white person who is less qualified or less deserving than a person of color just because of color. You know, it's the it's why we need anti-discrimination laws, right? If discrimination wasn't still an issue, why would we need anti-discrimination laws? Nobody does something because of people's color, but it's the fact that people are still biased and people still act racist and perform racist actions and make choices depending on race that we need some kind of racial component to it. Does that make sense?
Um, yeah, it does make sense, and like, I guess from like, yeah, I do get that. Like, so in Ireland, we kind of have our first and second generation black people here now. Like, I was into double digits before I met an authentically black person. I met a French guy who I thought was black. He wasn't. He was just hollow skinned. He's actually about the same complexion as you when you get some sun on you.
Yeah.
Um, but like, yeah, I mean, that's how ignorant I was when I was a kid to cultural diversity and all of that. So because I suppose the first generation of black people are kind of first and second generation of black people are now in Ireland. I think we there are certain elements of what's going on in the States that's been going on for generations, and solving that problem might be a bit more complicated. But just in terms of the idea of just throwing money at the problem, I don't see how without sounding super fucking cheesy, you know that whole phrase, give a man a fish versus teaching a man to fish.
Right. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
so
yeah.
cheesy. I don't even want to say it. but that's kind of what I feel like when it comes to giving somebody, like,
Agreed. So,
how much money are you going to give to every single black person? Like, at most $10,000,
right.
and that won't
So
last them.
that's where this conversation about defunding the police has come in, is really risen recently, right? Because we're
Right.
looking at what these communities actually need, right?
Yeah.
Do they need all of this law enforcement? Probably not, but they do need a lot of other things. So it's taking those resources that we pour into law enforcement and putting them into putting them in places where they'll be of greater help, right? To address public health disparities, disparities in how mental health is treated. I have a whole list: education, employment. there's there food,
Yeah.
food
You're not
disparities.
you're
Like
not talking about taking. You're not talking about putting less cops on the street. Like, we're not talking about disbanding the police force or
no,
anything
no,
like
no,
that.
no, no, no.
We're talking
Exactly.
about spending less money on fucking rubber bullets and
Yes. Well,
flashbangs.
that's another thing. Less the police making it less militaristic, right?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. In
Like,
terms,
they're literally driving tanks in some places.
yeah,
Like
absolutely. Yep, yep, yep. They sure are. They sure are. And that's the
that's
thing.
crazy. Like,
And now the question comes to us: why is this idea so controversial? Why is the idea of not because there are a lot of people who are saying abolish the police, and that's kind of the far left plank, right?
that's
But
crazy. Like, yeah, that's not even far left. That's just anarchic. That's like, I don't have a stance on politics at all. I
yeah,
just want it all gone.
well, the purge. But a lot of people are now in favor of defund the police, and but like polls, when people are polled on this issue, they're scared, right? They
Yeah.
Most people don't agree with even defund the police, and I think
Right.
in America, I know it's the same. Probably you can back me up on whether this is the case for you guys, but our history of using buzzwords, of using kind of coded language and appealing to fear uh, is kind of what leads us to shovel funding towards punitive and not towards preventative. Um,
Right.
the politics of fear, right? That's kind of what my president traffics in. It's what a lot of people throughout history have trafficked in, and it's it's a way for people to talk about like hidden prejudices, like saying things like law and order. Okay, well, it's a different. People know implicitly that it's a different kind of law and order for different kind of people, right? So
Right.
it's not really an honest conversation, you know? So now that people are starting to have these honest conversations, there's a hope that we can kind of shift mindsets around it. But again, the problem is that it has been coded in all of this hidden kind of language for such a long time, you know?
Right.
And I think there's this huge thing about people using identity politics or fear to get people to vote against their own self-interest. And to me, that's a huge, like probably the biggest barrier towards issues like this getting solved.
Yeah.
And I could go more
Yeah.
into that, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, like, I think if you break down like all of this stuff, including like long, deep ingrained racism, essentially what it boils down to is just two very, like, I might be way off track here, but two very simple things. One is the kind of binary nature of your voting system, where if your guy doesn't get in, like Bernie Sanders was a way better candidate from most Democrats' points of view, and yet Joe Biden essentially won. And really, the only thing that, like, Joe Biden had electability as his, like, electability as as
Yeah.
pretty much the only thing that won for him over Bernie Sanders. And I think that's kind of where all of your problems start, is that like I can't vote for the guy that I want to vote for. I have to vote for the guy that beats that horrible monster that's currently sitting in office. And like, okay, I understand. Like maybe I would have done the same, and maybe I would have voted for Biden, if push came to shove. But like, it's such a stupid system that it just shouldn't exist in the first
Yeah.
place.
Yeah. I
Um,
agree with you.
and like we've got the opposite system where if your guy gets eliminated, then your second choice gets counted, and so on and so forth. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
No,
would say I would
you're absolutely right, I think.
I would say that's because what it has done is that has created it has created a situation where like nobody would support Trump on uh, the majority of stuff that he says, only for the fact that it gets under Democrats' skirts. Like that's where most Republicans are coming from. They all hated him 4 years ago, and now
Well,
they now they know
it's
what his
all
balls taste like.
cultural. Now it's
Yeah, yeah,
all and that's they take advantage of that in order to get people to vote against their own self-interest.
yeah,
And
yeah. Absolutely.
I'm not, and I have my own opinions on what's happening, right? But if you look at what's actually being done by the Trump administration versus their rhetoric, right? We're going to drain the swamp. We're going to get all these corrupt people out of DC. We're going to fight for the common man. We're going to fight for veterans. We're going to fight for you, Joe Sixpack, and we're gonna get rid of all those commies and
Budweiser
hippies
Kelly.
and yeah, and but that's basically their argument. And we're gonna get rid of like those immigrants and people who are threatening your jobs, and we're gonna be strong and fight against lawlessness and blah blah blah. So that's the kind of rhetoric you get. But in reality, what you get is, for the most part, deregulation. Um, so companies are not being regulated as heavily as they were. You get tax cuts for corporations, which was basically his biggest domestic policy achievement. Um, you get taking us, putting like getting us in trade wars, right? Which
Yeah,
harms consumers and harms
it
farmers.
harms his base more than anybody
Yeah,
else, really,
yeah,
doesn't it? Like,
yeah, and and paring back social support for um, for the poor, and paring back support for example, mental health services, for social services, for if you pare back money and reproductive health and all of these things, it disproportionately affects his base, which is for the most part uh, low income white people. You know,
yeah,
so it's very interesting to see how gun rights, religion, abortion, uh, race, immigration, these are all buzzwords for cultural issues, which causes people to vote against their own self-interest.
yeah.
And
And then the other aspect of it is, so like that's kind of all one of the two things that I think has essentially generated everything from uh, Trump's election to the Black Lives Matter movement to like everything. And then the other one I think is lobbying. It's corruption, like it's
but that's the
um,
thing, is that, and that's a huge plank of that was a huge plank of his whole thing, is that the people in there are corrupt. I'm going to drain the swamp, right? That was a huge thing,
yeah,
right? When in reality, his is probably the least transparent administration we've seen in a long time. Every administration doesn't want to reveal politically embarrassing information, obviously. And
yeah,
Obama particularly went after leakers pretty hard. But there's a difference between that and not submitting to regular oversight. So, for example, the PPP, the Payment Protection Program in America, which gave loans to companies so that they could keep workers on their payroll. And if they gave a certain percentage of that money to their workers, then the loan would be forgiven, right? And it was a way for companies to help. It was a way to help the unemployment rate. But the Trump administration is refusing, after saying they would, they're refusing to share the names of the list of companies. Why? Don't know. You know?
Probably because top of that list is his own.
Exactly. And it's that kind of lack of transparency, and it happens in terms of use of the way that data and science is used by the scientists working for the administration. That's been heavily obfuscated. It's There's just a huge lack of accountability and a huge opportunity for basically Donny Boy and his rich friends to uh, leverage their power and their influence into more power, profit, and influence, right?
Do
But
you
again,
think that there was ever a point that that he actually thought he was going to be a good president? Like he must know at this point that he's not. That he's probably the most
now we're
reliable.
delving into the psychology of it.
But like I just think that like there was I don't know if I'm really entertaining this thought that like rather than the Republicans creating Trump, that it was actually the Democrats that created Trump. That like maybe like okay, he was always going to look after his own interests and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
the kind of loopy stuff that he comes out with, and like the crazy attacks he goes on and stuff like that. That maybe that's actually because of the Democrats rather than the Republicans.
And that's what a lot of people think. And that's kind of another issue with our two-party system, right? Is that usually it swings like a pendulum, right?
right. Yeah.
You vote for the person
It's the blame game, like
who's the opposite of the person you have, right?
yeah,
You go back Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump,
right, yeah,
right? And that's an iron law in American politics, basically. Um,
yeah,
and so because Obama specifically generated all of this friction and all of this angst, and it goes obviously beyond that. It goes into race, and uh, it goes into everything that people who didn't like Obama buy into, right? The whole birther thing, the whole he's a Kenyan, the whole well, he's not a real American, he's a Muslim, all that stuff. Um, all of that, people think all of that kind of congealed into the cultural undercurrents which swept Trump into office.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was like every one of your elections is essentially a reaction to the last election.
Exactly. And that's why so often after a new president gets put into power, and usually their party does very well in that election and they take over Congress, very often 2 years later, the next election, their party gets booted out of office because
Yeah,
people react to what they're doing, right?
right.
So yeah, it's very interesting in that way.
Which probably accounts for why your politics are so stagnant. Like if you don't have the House and the presidency, then you can't really get as much done.
Yeah, yeah, and well, another big reason for that is the fact that the presidency has become so much more powerful over the last 30, 40 years, but especially in the last 10, 20 years, compared to before when Congress really was calling the shots. The
Right.
presidency and the execution of like executive orders and a lot of his say on things like sanctions and trade and things like that. And like the Supreme Court, it's so overwhelmingly important to win the presidency. But
Yeah.
then that that it's almost doesn't matter who's in Congress, right?
Yeah.
Because Congress is such a give and take and up and down and can go either way. And then you have the
Mm-hmm.
presidency, which is one guy setting the agenda, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
that it's become so easy to just focus on the
And
presidency and let and ignore Congress. And that's why it's so rare for people to get voted out of Congress. People who are in office are overwhelmingly reelected.
all right. Yeah. And even if you do have a Congress that wants to make some changes, it'll get vetoed by the Senate anyway a lot of the time. So.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is that the House and the Senate right now are divided, so very little, if anything, is going to get passed by both House and Senate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, man, I have to go. But
absolutely. All right, so let's
we're
wrap
we're
up.
we're just getting into it properly there, weren't
We
we?
just got cooking. All right, so we're going to stop the recording here. Thank you to our one or two listeners, and we'll see you again soon.